this is going to be a tough one to keep short because I love Emily Dickinson. Like, Dickinson is probably one of the most important figures in all of poetry to me, in English poetry, because after her, there was a really, really new sense of what poetry was supposed to do. Everything before her seems so aggrandized. And like the big antithesis is as free verse became more the norm for poetry, the two schools split, and you have these almost polar opposites of Walt Whitman and Emily Dickinson. And I respect Walt Whitman, but Walt Whitman is almost like a shotgun of poetry. He throws everything that he can out there, and he just has these massive, long, just almost unending poems full of just bloated lines and just, gigantic descriptions. Emily Dickinson was like the exact opposite of that. Her lines are very tightly constructed. Her metaphors are very, very constrained. Her poems don't drag on and on and on and don't just think very highly of themselves. They're very small and compact things. And that, I've always been more sympathetic to poems that try to do more with less. That's always been the thing that I find the most poetic and the most striking, is when a poet can bring out a great deal of meaning with very, very little effort. That's just like the thing that really fascinates me and gets my poetry gears turning. Now, and that's not to detract from what Walt Whitman accomplished. His writing was just amazing. I mean, it's almost like getting hit with a tidal wave of intellectual and passionate inquiry. But Dickinson is so on point and so on target and so narrow and so very, very well just disciplined. And when you think Walt Whitman, you don't think disciplined. Dickinson is disciplined, but you also have to understand the differences in their demeanors. Walt Whitman was a larger-than-life figure. Everybody knew who Whitman was. He was a very, very cherished and beloved poet in his day. And, he played that role, and he was just an amazing guy. Dickinson was a very, very troubled person, it seems. She had a lot of very severe mishaps in her life, and she kind of just sort of retreated. She became a bit of a shut-in, and she spent a lot of time on these poems. And most of the poems were pretty much kept in little boxes and in places. She didn't title any of them. There's no numbers on them. Most of the titles are obviously just taken from either the first opening line or something that comes later in the poem itself. So it's almost like Dickinson was writing more for a psychological purpose, a psychological exploration. It's been a long time since I really studied the life of Emily Dickinson, but I do know that there were several instances where her poetry wasn't published. She lost loved ones. I believe her father I believe her father's death was very traumatic for her. So as you read her poetry and as her life kind of seems to have shrunk, and as she stopped going out into the world so much, and as she seems to become more and more depressed. And keep in mind, a lot of this is my conjecture. So if I say something just flat out bald-faced wrong in one of these videos, you can write about it and you can tell me how I'm wrong, and you'll get a good grade for that. So fact check me, please fact check me, because I am doing a lot of this from memory. I don't really do teaching and presentations from PowerPoint with everything rehearsed. That's just not how I operate. But as you read her poems, you get a real sense that her mind is almost like going in this downward trend as things collapse and metaphors get more and more cryptic and creepy. And it's funny because we don't really know what the timeline was for when these poems were written, but in my opinion, you can kind of tell a little bit of a progression, and I'm going to try to put that together for you in this video and another one to come. I'm going to actually start with one of what I think are what I would call the more stable poems, I'm not gonna go into the really dark kind of unsettling stuff until the next video, but I do want to lay a little bit of foundation here. That Dickinson was not just, you know, an isolated emo kid. She seems to have had some pretty, you know, thrilling experiences in her life, and she did explore some of that in poetry, and she does, you know, talk about positive things. So we don't really see. I didn't read this poem until I was in college. I didn't really run into it in the whole high school literature thing, so I'd like to share it with you. This is Wild Nights, and ooh, this one's hot and steamy. I love this poem. It's weird to get excited about something like a poem. And I know that, like, there's virtually no one on planet Earth who feels this way about poetry. It's a little depressing. Anyway, Wild Nights. Again, we don't really know what the historical context for this poem is, because she never really wrote about herself in explicit terms. She just, you know, all we have of her is her poetry. And, you know, the letters and correspondence, but, you know, we don't really understand what specifically these poems connect to in her life. Wild Nights. Wild nights, were I with thee, wild nights should be our luxury. Almost sounds Shakespearean in a really interesting way. Futile the winds to a heart in port, done with the compass, done with the chart. Rowing in Eden, ah, the sea, might I but more tonight in thee. Ooh, man, steamy. Woo-hoo. That's some ribald stuff right there. Man, go Emily. Anyway, yes, the last stanza does have a little sexual innuendo, in case you were wondering. More tonight in thee is pretty on the nose there, but I mean, hey, that's all well and good. I'm definitely not knocking it. As we look at this poem, we see that the rhyme don't really have, you know, consistent rhyme here. A little bit of inside rhyme, a little bit of, like, maybe a little bit of the slant rhyme. But the thing that I like to point out to people, and I'm doing this, like, right off the top of my head, so this might end up blowing up in my face, but we're going to try it. Dickinson's poetry follows a very odd meter, in that most of the time what she was doing was she was writing in the same way that old-time hymnals would, you know, be organized. So most Emily Dickinson poems you can set to the tune of Amazing Grace, and it works extremely well. And it's because, you know, she was following those very simple kind of like sing-along patterns. Let's give it a try. Ugh, this is probably gonna be terrible, but let's see what we can come up with. Wild nights, were I with thee. Wild night should be. It works. Yes. I'm going to abandon it because I already feel really stupid, but Dickinson was a very, very religious person, and it's something very important to understand about her, is that her religiosity was something that creeps up into the poem over and over again. But you'll see, as I postulate and we move forward with this analysis, Dickinson's religious ideas take some very odd turns. And what starts with kind of like an experimentation with rhyme and meter, which is, you know, interesting in a poem that is so obviously, you know, got a little bit of the passionate, sensual, intimate nature. It's not completely outside of the realm of expectation that you would evoke like a religious sound for that. I mean, it's definitely not too terribly controversial. But as we move into the darker poems, where I believe, like, in a way, her mind collapsed and her language begins to break down, you'll find that those religious terms start to get much, much more unsettling. Until then, y'all have fun.